Now it's time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Good evening, Lawrence.
Alex, if there are any two kids in the world who should not be embarrassed by their dad.
Let me just be clear.
I know what you mean.
Not their dad in general.
I know.
Just
I know.
lose yourself. And I'm not saying they should be. I'm just saying we ask the question. We turn it over on the podcast.
Alex, 2 weeks and get used to it. I'm going to be here every night, Friday nights, 2 weeks in a row. This is it. This is the final stretch. We're staying with it
it's serious.
every day. Yeah, you know it's
serious.
Yeah.
It's getting real. If we get you on a Friday night, I love to see it.
Yeah. And Alex, you may know that Martin Sheen is from Ohio, which explains why he will be joining us tonight with Sherrod Brown from Ohio.
That's what they call a twofer.
There you go.
Have a great show.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you. It has been 80 years since Adolf Hitler was a factor in an American presidential election. And now Hitler is back, with Donald Trump quoted praising Adolf Hitler, saying Adolf Hitler did some good things. Donald Trump has not said what those good things are. Donald Trump's response today to his former White House Chief of Staff, Marine Corps General John Kelly, quoting Donald Trump's praise of Hitler, was not to deny the words that John Kelly quoted Donald Trump saying. Donald Trump's response was a written statement simply calling John Kelly, quote, a total degenerate. Donald Trump did not issue a statement saying Hitler did not do some good things. Donald Trump could have issued a statement saying that, but he didn't. Donald Trump knows that he has the American Nazi supporters out there who are going to vote for him. Actual American Nazis. Small sliver of Trump voters, but he needs every one of them. Donald Trump knows that he needs every total degenerate American Nazi voter in every swing state to vote for him. And so Donald Trump cannot afford to lose a single one of them. And that's why he refused to condemn Hitler today and only condemned John Kelly. What are the good things? What are the good things that Hitler did? That is the first question for Donald Trump, for any reporter who is next allowed to ask a question of Trump. What are the good things Hitler did? Hitler is known for attempting to exterminate every Jewish person living in Europe, and he hoped to exterminate every Jew living in the world. Hitler tried to fulfill that ambition by annihilating 6 million men, women, and children. Grandfathers, grandmothers, great-grandfathers, babies. And while Hitler was at it in those death camps, in combat, Hitler killed as many American soldiers as he possibly could. Adolf Hitler introduced the idea of bombing civilian populations from the air that had no military strategic objective. He killed men, women, and children in London that way. Adolf Hitler was from start to finish a raving madman who committed suicide when he knew he had lost World War II. What good things?
What would you say when he said to you that Hitler did a lot of good things?
Well, I tell him that. I said, first of all, you should never say that. But if you knew what Hitler was all about from the beginning to the end, everything he did was in support of his racist, fascist life, philosophy, so that nothing he did you could argue was good.
The next reporter to ask Donald Trump a question must ask him, what good things did Hitler do? Reporters must also ask Donald Trump what bad things Hitler did. And watch how reluctant Donald Trump will be to publicly condemn Hitler, because Donald Trump fears losing a single vote from a single degenerate American Nazi. Donald Trump has been quoted by multiple sources saying he wished he had Hitler's generals. Jeffrey Goldberg reported more of Donald Trump's praise of Hitler and his generals in a piece in The Atlantic yesterday under the headline, Trump, I need the kind of generals that Hitler had. Hitler's generals were murderous anti-Semites who were also the worst generals fighting World War II in Europe. Hitler's generals were wrong. about how to fight the war, and they lost every major battle against the great American generals who Donald Trump dishonors with his perverse anti-Semitic praise of Hitler and Hitler's generals. And Hitler's generals conspired repeatedly to assassinate Adolf Hitler, but because they were incompetent, Hitler's generals failed in every attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler. But Donald Trump wants Hitler's generals. He doesn't want Franklin Roosevelt's generals, the generals who actually won World War II. George C. Marshall, the general who masterminded the entire American approach to World War II in the Atlantic and the Pacific. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who won the war in Europe and became president of the United States. Legendary generals George Patton, Douglas MacArthur, General Omar Bradley. Donald Trump doesn't want any of them. You know who didn't want Hitler's generals? Hitler. Hitler thought his generals were clowns in the same way that Donald Trump thinks that the generals in command of the American military now are clowns. Jeffrey Goldberg reports, quote, when Trump raised the subject of German generals, Kelly responded by asking, do you mean Bismarck's generals? He went on, I mean, I knew he didn't know who Bismarck was or about the Franco-Prussian War. I said, do you mean the Kaiser's generals? Surely you can't mean Hitler's generals. And he said, yeah, Hitler's generals. Donald Trump comes from a German family who changed their name from Drumpf to Americanize the sound of that name. But Donald Drumpf cannot Americanize his admiration for Adolf Hitler and Adolf Hitler's generals. 80 years ago, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was running for re-election at the height of World War II in 1944. President Roosevelt and his Republican challenger, the governor of New York, Thomas Dewey, did not disagree about Adolf Hitler. They both knew that he was the most deadly and evil enemy the United States ever faced. 4 years earlier, after Hitler had started World War II, but the United States was not yet involved, in the 1940 presidential campaign, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his Republican challenger did not disagree about the dangers of Adolf Hitler, who was already marching his way across Europe. Donald Trump is the only presidential nominee of a major party in the history of this country who has admired Adolf Hitler, the only one. The Vice President of the United States addressed Donald Trump's praise of Adolf Hitler and Adolf Hitler's generals today at the Vice President's residence in Washington.
Yesterday, we learned that Donald Trump's former Chief of Staff, John Kelly, a retired four-star general, confirmed that while Donald Trump was president, he said he wanted generals like Adolf Hitler had. Donald Trump said that because he does not want a military that is loyal to the United States Constitution. He wants a military that is loyal to him. He wants a military who will be loyal to him personally, one that will obey his orders even when he tells them to break the law or abandon their oath to the Constitution of the United States. All of this is further evidence for the American people of who Donald Trump really is. This is a window into who Donald Trump really is, from the people who know him best, from the people who worked with him side by side in the Oval Office and in the Situation Room. So the bottom line is this. We know what Donald Trump wants. He wants unchecked power. The question in 13 days will be, what do the American people want? Thank you.
Former cast members from NBC's series The West Wing, about a fictional White House, led by their fictional president, played by Martin Sheen, have been on the campaign trail for Kamala Harris. And tonight, Martin Sheen has returned to his home state of Ohio, where he is campaigning for his good friend, Senator Sherrod Brown's reelection. There was a time when I was a writer on the West Wing series that I got a very important call from Washington asking if I thought Martin Sheen could be persuaded at the end of the series to run for Senate in Ohio. He could not be persuaded, but remains concerned about Ohio and its future, which is why he is campaigning there tonight with Sherrod Brown. Martin Sheen and Sherrod Brown will join us in a moment. Sherrod Brown has received a Republican endorsement in Ohio that is even more important in Ohio than Liz Cheney's Republican endorsement for Kamala Harris is for the rest of the country. The most politically successful Republican dynasty family in history is not the Bushes. It is the Taft family. William Howard Taft served one term as president of the United States. The president's son, Robert Taft, became the Republican Senate Majority Leader from Ohio. Robert Taft's son, Robert Taft Jr., followed in his father's footsteps in the United States Senate, representing Ohio. Robert Taft III served 2 terms as Ohio's governor from 1999 to 2007. In the Dayton Daily News this week, Governor Taft wrote, "I have always run for office under the banner of the Republican Party, am a conservative, and usually vote a straight Republican ticket. Although still a Republican, I will be making an exception this year in Ohio's U.S. Senate race by supporting Sherrod Brown." Leading off our discussion tonight, 2 of Ohio's native sons. Ohio Senator Democrat Sherrod Brown, running for his 4th term in the Senate. He is the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee and member of the Senate Finance Committee. Also with him, Martin Sheen, who campaigned with his friend Sherrod Brown today. Great to see you both. Martin, when you look at this candidate for Senate who has served in the United States Senate, what do you see and why do you want him reelected?
I see one of my heroes, and I'm very proud to support him. And I see a man who stands on his beliefs, and he reflects the very best part of us, and he challenges us to stand up for what we believe and stiffen our spines and to live an honest and decent life to begin with, but to go further with that and serve in public with that same kind of energy and faith.
Sherrod, what does it mean to you to have Martin at your side campaigning? Again, he's done this before for you, I know.
Well, Connie and I love Martin Sheen, and he's been campaigning. This is the 3rd election. He campaigned with John Glenn, with Connie and me back in 2012. The story I love to tell is Martin Sheen's first job in Dayton, Ohio, when he was growing up, and he was a caddy at the Dayton Country Club, and he tried to organize a caddies union, and he got fired. So how could you not love somebody that kicked off his acting career and his political career, and I guess his golfing career, his sports career, or whatever by that? So I admire, he's somebody that's never lost touch with people in Dayton. He's never lost touch. I talk about the dignity of work, as you know. Martin has embodied it as a hard worker, whatever he did, and he's just a kind man. And Connie and I loved, he rides in the back seat, and Connie and he talked the whole trip as we go from Columbus to Toledo, or to Columbus to Dayton to Cincinnati back to Cleveland. So it's just an honor to have him here.
Oh, that's the car to be in during this campaign. That sounds great. Senator, when you talk about the dignity of work, what is at stake for workers in Ohio in this election?
Well, the contrast is clear. I fought for the dignity of work my whole career. My opponent, Bernie Moreno, he stiffed his own workers out of $400,000 in overtime. Then he destroyed the evidence that the court demanded, and to pay them back. And how do you trust somebody that stiffs his own workers to look out for workers in Ohio? And what that means, though, is they're literally spending more money in this race against me than any Senate race in history. And I'm outspent, clearly. I ask people to go to SherrodBrown.com and chip in $15 or $20 in a race where I'm getting outspent. But Martin saw today in Gahanna and saw in Columbus, going to see in Dayton and Cincinnati and Cleveland, the incredible enthusiasm of so many volunteers that really do want to stand. Part of that is abortion rights. Bernie Moreno wants a national abortion ban, no exceptions. I fought for issue 1 last fall, the constitutional amendment for abortion rights. 57% of Ohioans agree with me, and Bernie thinks he knows better. So this contrast is really clear in Martin, because of what's in his core and in his gut and in his heart, helps us get that message across.
Martin, what are you hearing from Ohio voters about what matters to them?
Well, the abortion issue is paramount to most voters. Although that you don't hear a lot of talk about that in public. I think it's a very private concern as well. But they are concerned about Sherrod's leadership and his continual service from the nation's capital to our home state of Ohio. And across the board, you know, everybody knows who he is, where he comes from, what he stands for, and they're going to send him back to the U.S. Senate for a fourth term.
Martin,
I have not the slightest doubt.
Martin, you know Ohio political history. Did you ever expect an endorsement of a Democratic Senate candidate from Bob Taft?
No, that's pretty remarkable. I just heard about that today, and that is a remarkable turnaround. And it's going to sway a lot of folks. It's certainly getting a lot of attention here. And it was published in my hometown newspaper, Dayton, in Dayton, Ohio. So there are a lot of conservatives there who are going to be get a slap on the back with this. They're going to have to think twice. Who they're going to vote for very soon.
And you know, Lawrence, you may know I've lost one election in my life, and it was to Bob Taft. So that letter appeared in the Dayton Daily News that he was endorsing me. It was pretty wonderful. And he's a good man, and he speaks for a fourth-generation conservatism, but an honest conservatism where people can debate these issues and not be washed over by tens of millions of dollars. And as I've said before, and people coming to SherrodBrown.com can help us a little bit with that to make up for some of the tens of millions of dollars in this race.
We have so much to cover in the presidential campaign. I wish I could spend the hour with these two, Senator Sherrod Brown and my dear friend Martin Sheen. Thank you very much for starting off our discussions tonight.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you very much, Lawrence.
And coming up, Vice President Harris just wrapped up a town hall where she answered questions from undecided voters in Pennsylvania. We'll show you some of that after this break. And Quentin Folks, Principal Deputy Campaign Manager for the Harris-Walz campaign, will join us. Tonight, Vice President Harris was asked if Donald Trump is a fascist.
Do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I also believe that the people who know him best on this subject should be trusted. Again, look at their careers. These are not people, with the exception, I think, of only Mike Pence. These were not politicians. These are career people who have served in the highest roles in national security, who have served as generals in our military, who are highly respected, talking about the person who would be commander-in-chief, not to mention what we know and what they've told us about how he talks about the military, servicemen and women, referring to them as suckers and losers, how he demeans people who have taken an oath to sacrifice their life for our country. And I do believe, Anderson, that part of this is why, even just this week, I traveled this state and others with Liz Cheney, former Congress member who was a very high-ranking Republican. She has endorsed me. Her father, the former Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney, is voting for me. Over 400 previous members of the administration, from Ronald Reagan to both Presidents Bush to Donald Trump even, have endorsed my candidacy. And the reason why, among them, is a legitimate fear based on Donald Trump's words and actions that he will not obey an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. He himself has said he would terminate the Constitution of the United States and wants to earn your vote to stand again behind the seal of the President of the United States? No one standing behind the seal of the President of the United States of America should be in that position saying they want to terminate the Constitution of the United States.
Joining our coverage now is Quentin Folks, Principal Deputy Campaign Manager for the Harris-Walz campaign. What do you think the Vice President accomplished in this town hall tonight?
Well, look, Lawrence, what you saw on that stage tonight was a president. I think that the vice president laid out the stakes of this election. She laid out her positions in this election and how she wants to move this country forward and bring in a new economic opportunity economy so everybody can get ahead. Look, tonight was supposed to be a debate, Lawrence. We shouldn't let that slip. The vice president has been putting herself out there. She has been going into spaces and places where people don't expect to see Democratic nominees for president of the United States, and Donald Trump has been hiding. He has been only doing interviews with friendly outlets like Fox News. He's been staging photo ops in McDonald's when he is still opposing raising the federal minimum wage. This is who Donald Trump is. But what Americans saw tonight from the vice president was somebody who is ready to be commander in chief, who takes it seriously and will wake up thinking about them every single day, while Donald Trump only thinks about himself.
Yeah, it's a matter of public record that Donald Trump is afraid of debating Kamala Harris again. It's a matter of public record that Donald Trump got destroyed in his debate with Kamala Harris. Let's listen to what the vice president said tonight about Donald Trump not showing up for tonight's event.
But when companies are taking advantage of the desperation and the need of the American people, we saw it actually during the pandemic as well, where because of supply chain issues, there was a reduction of supply, and then they would inflate the price of everyday necessities. Not to mention, by the way, again, Donald Trump should be here tonight to talk with you and answer your questions. He's not. He refused to come. But understand that part of his plan is to put in place a national sales tax of at least 20% on everyday goods and necessities. And that, by economist estimates, independent economists, would cost you as the American consumer and taxpayer an additional $4,000 a year.
Is that the issue, the primary issue that the vice president will be focusing on between now and the closing of this campaign?
Well, look, I think it's one of many. Obviously, the economy is top of mind for a lot of voters, and Donald Trump's tax will increase cost on families by $4,000 a year. That is a fact. The vice president is focused on making sure she gets her economic agenda out there. The fact that she wants to make sure that she's expanding Medicare, strengthening Social Security and the Affordable Care Act, but also reproductive freedom and abortion remains one. Donald Trump is still responsible for the fact that 1 in 3 women of reproductive age live under a national abortion ban. And he is going to continue that. And then, obviously, his plans for the future beyond the economy. Project 2025. This is somebody who is talking about using the military against American citizens, the enemy from within, as he calls it. This is dangerous stuff. And I think you showed a clip earlier, Lawrence, of the vice president talking about why Republicans who have worked for Donald Trump, like 4-star General John Kelly, are saying these things. They are afraid. And that's a sad state in America. I want people at home to really think about this. We have 12 days left in this election, really. Think about this, why these Republicans are saying this about Donald Trump. They've worked for him. They've been in these closed-door meetings with him. They are afraid of how he will use power. And he's saying things like he will have extreme power as president. He will have immunity that a Supreme Court that he largely appointed has given him. This is dangerous stuff, Lawrence, and people should listen to it. And so we're going to continue to point out this danger while also at the same time, as the vice president did tonight, defiantly talking about her vision for the future of this country to clearly lay out the stakes of this election.
Donald Trump cannot name an American general he admires, even from history. This town hall began tonight with Anderson Cooper asking the vice president about Donald Trump's comments praising Hitler. Did you ever expect at the start of this campaign that 79 years after Hitler killed himself, 80 years after Hitler was last a factor in a presidential campaign during World War II, that in the closing weeks, we'd be talking about Donald Trump's praise of Adolf Hitler and Adolf Hitler's generals at the end of this campaign?
Lawrence, I wish that the answer to that question was no, but unfortunately, it's not. Donald Trump has been doing this. He's been stoking it. He's been urging people to come out with Nazi flags at his events and at his rallies. He's been stoking this because that is how he leads. He thinks that punching down on the weakest of us in our society and the most vulnerable is strength. He thinks that inciting political violence and using rhetoric like turning the United States military, again, a general that worked for Donald Trump as his chief of staff, said that Donald Trump had to be told multiple times that he cannot use the military on American citizens. This is what we're talking about here. So I wish that the answer to that question was no, but unfortunately it's not. I'm not surprised anymore. And it is our job to continue to make sure that we're getting the message out there that a second Donald Trump term will be extremely dangerous for this country. And all the freedoms and rights that people have will be overturned.
So Donald Trump is confronted with John Kelly's statements where Donald Trump says that he thinks Hitler did some good things. And when Donald Trump issues a written response to John Kelly today, he does not say Hitler did not do good things. Do you think, knowing what you know about the polling and the slices of voting that is out there, that in key battleground states, Donald Trump believes that there are actual American Nazis numbering in the thousands or several hundred, at least, in each battleground state, who could be the margin of victory for him in that state? And that's why he is afraid of condemning Nazism?
I don't think that is what he believes, to be honest with you. I think that his hope is that people will see America as a dark place, as a divisive place, as a place where we have to hate one another in order to get ahead, that we have to demean each other to get ahead, because that's who he is. It's who he's always been, and he continues to show us that at every turn. And so he's hoping that people are going to buy it. But look, I am very confident, because this has been somewhat of a somber interview, but I'm very confident because of the work that this campaign has put in, because of the work that the vice president has been doing to talk about her vision for the future of this country and draw the contrast between herself, where she wants to take this country, and Donald Trump's dark and divisive vision for this country. He's unhinged. He's unstable. But the vice president is hopeful. She sees a bright future for America, one where we can all get ahead, both Republicans and Democrats, one where she can find common sense solutions on both sides of the aisle and bring them to the American people so that they are the ones who are benefiting, because that's what this country is built on. And so while Donald Trump may be banking on his divisive nature to be what breaks through, we're very confident that in 12 days, Americans are going to turn out to vote, as they already are beginning to vote in a lot of the battleground states, and they're going to send Kamala Harris and Tim Walz to the White House.
Quentin Fowkes, who pulled off the Georgia miracle for Raphael Warnock as a campaign manager, trying to do it again for Kamala Harris, thank you very much for joining us on this busy night for you.
Thank you, Lawrence. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. And coming up, we'll get reaction to tonight's town hall event with someone who is a veteran of presidential campaigning, former White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki.
Our country deserves to have a president of the United States who is not afraid of good ideas and does not stand on pride. If a perspective needs to be informed by different points of view to build consensus and to have a common sense approach, I'm never going to shy away from good ideas. And I'm not going to feel the need to have pride associate with a position that I've taken, when the important thing is to build consensus to fix problems. I believe in fixing problems. I love fixing problems. And so I pledge to you to be a president who not only works for all Americans, but works on getting stuff done. And that means compromise. And it doesn't mean compromising your values or your principles, but it does mean working to get stuff done. And I pledge to you I will do that.
Joining our discussion now, Jen Psaki, former White House press secretary, host of Inside with Jen Psaki on MSNBC, and a veteran of presidential campaigns.
Yes,
Obama presidential campaigns, Biden presidential campaigns.
John Kerry, too, don't forget
John
him.
Kerry, yes. And I have worked on exactly 0 presidential campaigns, which I always like to emphasize. And I never think I'm smarter than those, professional Democrats.
You do know a lot about how government works, though.
That's
Lawrence.
different from campaigns.
It matters.
So here's what I loved about that answer. I loved her saying that it will ultimately come down to compromise, because the press and candidates, but mostly the press, pretends they're covering the election of a king. And they accept sentences like, I'm going to do X. No, you're not. Congress is going to decide whether they do that or how much of that they do. And I love the way that concept was included in that answer.
I loved that, too. I also loved what I also heard in there was that she acknowledged that you can change your point of view,
Yeah.
because of events, because of learning from people around you. Look at what Tim Walz has done on his positions on gun safety reforms. That is strength. That is not weakness. That is strength in a leader. The compromise piece is so important, not just in terms of how she's campaigning, and this is where we can tap into your government nerdiness, Lawrence, which I know you have a lot in your heart, is compromise is how anything gets done in Washington. It's never perfect. It is about negotiation. Is it about finding common ground? And it is about giving up some things because you can't allow the perfect to be the enemy of progress. That is how things get done in Washington, how things get done diplomatically overseas when you're trying to negotiate treaties, when you're trying to negotiate deals. That is a key part of leadership.
Let's listen to what she said about Donald Trump, Kim Jong-un, and other things.
If the president of the United States, the commander in chief, is saying to his generals, in essence, why can't you be more like Hitler's generals, Anderson? Come on. This is a serious, serious issue. And we know who he is. He admires dictators, sending love letters back and forth with Kim Jong-un. Talks about the president of Russia, and then most recently, the reports are that in the height of COVID, when most Americans could not get their hands on a COVID test, Americans were dying by the hundreds a day. He secretly sent COVID tests to the president of Russia for his personal use. So again, this election in 13 days is presenting the American people with a very significant decision. And on the one side, on this issue of who is going to model what it means to use the bully pulpit of the President of the United States in a manner that in tone, word, and deed is about lifting up our discourse, fighting against hate, as opposed to fanning the flames of hate, which Donald Trump does consistently. I'm going to tell you, we are an incredible country, and we love our country. Y'all wouldn't be here unless we love our country. And there are certain things where we've just got to come together and realize that we do believe in the importance of healthy debate on real issues, but there are certain standards we've got to have. And, you know, another point that even John Kelly talked about, I believe, and many have, is January 6th, where you have the President of the United States defying the will of the people in a free and fair election and unleashing a violent mob who attacked the United States Capitol. 140 law enforcement officers were attacked. Some were killed. And so I say that to say the American people deserve to have a president who encourages healthy debate, works across the aisle, not afraid of good ideas wherever they come from, but also maintains certain standards about how we think about the role and the responsibility, and certainly not comparing oneself in a clearly admiring way to Hitler.
She packed so much into that response.
She did. And I think you asked Clinton folks this question, which I wanted to hear what he had to say. Is this their closing argument? It is their closing argument. Of course, there are ads being run on a range of things. She will talk about a range of things she talked about tonight, abortion rights, economy. But their closing argument is reminding the American people of who we are as a country, what a leader should look like and be, what the norms are in this country, and that she will be a defender of democracy and rights. Their closing argument is reminding people of what is at risk if Trump is elected, which is interesting because it's coming full circle in some ways to where the argument was just 4 or 5 months ago. But to me, it tells me that they think they're undecided voters. They think they can get some of the Cheney voters, maybe some of the Nikki Haley voters. It also is a reminder that people care about democracy in this country. They care about norms. And I think that's probably why it's the closing argument.
We're going to squeeze in a break right here. We're going to be back with more of what the vice president had to say tonight in that town hall. We'll be right back.
Madam Vice President, everybody as human beings, we're not perfect. We have our flaws. We make mistakes. We have our weaknesses. And the office of the presidency can sometimes bring those weaknesses out in ways that the incumbent may not expect. What weaknesses do you bring to the table, and how do you plan to overcome them while you're in office?
That's a great question, Joe. Well, I am certainly not perfect, so let's start there. And I think that perhaps a weakness, some would say, but I actually think it's a strength, is I really do value having a team of very smart people around me who bring to my decision-making process different perspectives. My team will tell you, I am constantly saying, let's kick the tire on that. Let's kick the tires on it. Because, listen, as I mentioned earlier, I started my career as a prosecutor. I was a courtroom prosecutor. I've tried everything from low-level offenses to homicides. And I learned at a very early stage of my career and adult life that my actions have a direct impact on real people in a very fundamental way. When I was Attorney General of California, I was Attorney General of what is the 5th largest economy in the world, and acutely aware that my words could move markets. So I take my role and responsibility as an elected leader very seriously, and I know the impact it has on so many people I may never meet. And that is why I engage and bring folks around. So I may not be quick to have the answer as soon as you ask it about a specific policy issue sometimes, because I'm going to want to research it. I'm going to want to study it. I'm kind of a nerd sometimes, I confess. And some might call that a weakness, especially if you're, in an interview or just kind of, being asked a certain question and you're expected to have the right answer right away. But that's how I work.
Jen, so a presidential candidate admits that the president of the United States has the biggest staff of any politician in America.
And she's kind of a nerd sometimes.
Right.
I mean, no kidding. We love nerds, first of all. This is how it works, right? And this is how it works in a White House. I've worked for 2 presidents. One of the things that President Obama used to do that at the time I was the person sitting on the back bench in the room is if you were quiet in the room, he would call on you and say, well, what do you think?
Oh, no. I was always quiet for a reason. I had nothing to say. Don't call on me.
Well, why that is an interesting thing that she brought up is because presidents don't do it alone. Right. The people who surround them are very important, who they pick as their chief of staff, who they nominate to the cabinet, who they surround themselves with. I don't know that people will vote on this, but they should, because this is a very big contrast. Vice President Harris is going to have Governor Tim Walz sitting next to her in the room, right? Donald Trump would have J.D. Vance and probably Stephen Miller and Russ Vought and whomever else, people who will just say to him, yes, sir, you're right, sir, yes, sir. What she said tonight is she's looking for people to raise alternatives, to question, to come up with ideas. That's how it should be. And she should challenge them back, too. That's also what presidents do. But that is a big, big difference between these candidates.
So CNN announced tonight that not only did Donald Trump turn down the debate possibility of tonight, but he also turned down exactly the same offer of a town hall, exactly like what the vice president just did.
Well, Donald Trump is moving farther and farther into a safe space where even Fox News does not have a comfy enough couch with enough support for him on that couch. And certainly there's a lot of support for him on that couch. That tells you a lot. And that tells you also about it's a leadership quality, certainly. Kamala Harris just had an interview with Bret Baier last week. Fox News host, good at his job. It was contentious. There were some tough questions. There was a moment where she called him out. She dove right into that lion's den. Donald Trump is scared to have a town hall where he's answering questions from average people. That tells you a lot.
What are you looking for over the next 13 days, I guess it is?
Well, as you like to say, Lawrence, and I'm going to quote you, we don't really know everything. Only
but
voters know everything.
You have worked in presidential campaigns. That's why I'm asking you. I don't ask other people.
Well, I don't know.
stuff.
Okay, well, you do. But here's what I'm watching. Early vote numbers in states, not to compare them to 2020 because 2020 was COVID, and most people were voting from home. But that's an interesting thing to watch. There are some numbers that are good signs for Republicans. Just to be clear, in Nevada, there are good signs for Democrats in a number of other states too. That's an interesting thing to watch. What is the excitement and enthusiasm out there? I'm also looking at, there's some interesting numbers. I'm very interested in white women and where they are, not just because I am a white woman, but because 4 years ago, Trump won white women by 11 points. 8 years ago, he won white women by 9 points. Right now, that's a group that's tied. I think the Dobbs decision, abortion rights, remains an undervalued issue among the electorate and what's moving them. So that's another thing. We won't know the results until election night, but I'm interested to see where that sits out there. But lots of things to watch. Those are just a couple of them I'm watching.
How are you going to cover these final days of the campaign? This is the first time you've had to cover
that is
campaign.
True. Well, I'll just watch what you do and try to copy it. No, I think the most important thing, and I know this even though I haven't sat at this table with all of you on a presidential election night, you don't know what's going to happen until it happens. And I really mean that. There will be surprising outcomes in House races and Senate races, in counties. There will be higher turnout than expected in some places and lower in others. And what's important is to be in the moment and throw the predictions out the window, because you can't predict what every voter is going to do. You can watch trends, you can look at indicators, but you have to be in the moment of that night. So I will have lots of caffeine and chocolate-covered espresso beans or something.
Jen Psaki is loading up on the caffeine. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Tonight's last word is next. Here is some of what President Obama had to say on the podcast called The Young Man and the Three.
The idea that we wouldn't just spend half an hour to vote, you know, as Michelle likes, when we were talking to our daughters about voting, we used to say, so let me get this straight. You're not going to vote, which means you're going to let a bunch of old people decide your future. You wouldn't do that about your music. You wouldn't do that about your clothes. But you're going to let them decide what your future, your potential careers, what the environment's going to look like. You're going to let them decide that? And you're just going to opt out. That doesn't make any sense. And that, I think, is the main message that I have for folks. It's not that hard to vote. And, you know, shoot, you know, people vote for All-Star Weekend. You know, people vote on everything. They're voting on American Idol. You can vote to decide who's going to represent you in our country.
President Obama gets tonight's last word.